All right, thank you, Ray. Appreciate the questions coming in from those participants out there who have them, because I think we've all been there and had questions as we're learning about the watershed programs. And sometimes it's helpful to discuss those because you really learn from other people's experience, kind of how they've addressed those. So I think that's really valuable, and I'll try to do that as before I start my section of the presentation. Really, I'm going to go through a few scenarios. The first item is, just an understanding of how complex, when you start planning in watersheds, you really can get to some complicated scenarios. And these watershed projects are very complex. You're trying to address multiple purposes within a watershed, multiple communities at times, multiple species, multiple cropping systems, and multiple individuals that have an impact. So this is, just an example of a project where it was, some of the water was used in the municipality and some of the water was diverted for irrigation above the town and brought in an irrigation system to farms and ranches where it was applied. Some of it was sent to areas that were used for fish and wildlife. Some of that water out of the river, and consideration needed to be given to the endangered species in the stream right here. And I'll just use my pointer, I guess, to point to where those areas are. But some of the issues revolved around the species and the timing of water distribution to those species in the late summer months when they needed help. And so this is just to point out just how complex our watershed operations and often rehabilitation and EWP. The systems we work in are natural, but a lot of them are in the built environment. So it's always very challenging, always very difficult, and there's always lots of folks who want to have a say in what's done in a watershed. And so that's why we take the time to plan those on a watershed scale and make sure that we understand all the considerations that go into them. Doesn't mean that you have to follow or exactly do everything, because you're never going to do something that's going to make every single person happy. But we seek to try to find the best and most economical way to accomplish the purposes that we're after there. So I think it's just good to remember, like, we're working in really complex scenarios in complex systems and mixing a built and a natural environment, and it's challenging. So So here we'll go to the next question that we had, which is, what is the process? This is a question that Ray was asking, and somebody had asked in the chat. One of the questions that came into us. April and I have done our best to try to get as many of these questions answered because we wanted to talk about the things that were important to you as participants. And so we spent a lot of time going over the many, many questions, almost 100 questions submitted. And so this was one of them. And so I'm going to break it down with different programs, because I think the answer kind of is dependent on the program and the type of practices or measures that are installed with the program. So, for emergency watershed protection, here's an example from a flood event that we had working on. And, would we really need to maintain the flood easements that we use to do debris removal around these bridges? Well, no. The Department of Transportation, the county went and got these temporary flood access easements at the time, but they were largely along highway right-of-ways or with practices that were very temporary in nature and only for the time that the flooding was taking place. And so, your operation and maintenance needs on a practice like debris removal are going to be a lot different than they are with, for example, stream bank stabilization. Here's another one of the practices that we do often in EWP, where your stream bank stabilization, if a flood comes, the next flood comes into it and washes some of that stream bank protection out, you're going to want to have some sort of an easement to access that site again. And it's really dependent on the sponsor. NRCS does not prescribe the type of easement that you need for a practice, just that you need to acquire the needed easements necessary for the construction, operation, and maintenance of the practice. And so it really is, there's a lot left to the sponsor here by NRCS, just because the sponsor is going to be the one who's going to maintain those practices and find ways to get in there and maintain those in the future. And so it's going to be largely dependent upon the site that you're on and also the practice that you're on, whether you're going to really maintain any sort of an easement after the practices are installed, where EWP is such a temporary and kind of a disaster response type program. So I want to give another example from watershed operations and rehab, just so much more different than EWP temporary measures that are taken after a flood event, where these dams and pipelines that are built, we need long-term easements around this infrastructure, because even just day to day, there's a need for access and for repairs and cleaning, and gates that need to be cleaned off, or small amounts of debris catching up on the spillway or in the pipe, or we need to be in and out for water control, controlling the elevation of the water at the structure itself. So sometimes those accesses are daily, whereas think back to EWP and temporary measures, debris removal, you're going to go in and remove the debris, but you're probably not going back again, because the debris might be in a whole different place in the next event. So I think that the question on returning watershed sites back to the landowners once they've reached their program life really is a different question for each different program. Now, for the dams, your state regulator, after the program life is, we've hit that program life, and that program life is just like it says in this slide, it's between 50 and 100 years for one of our dams. And so, but the benefits and the things that are provided by that dam, the need for that dam, the need for the flood protection that dam provides, or the water supply that dam provides for the local community, still is going on after the program life. And so until that practice is removed out of service or decommissioned or taken out, really, there is a need for those easements to remain in place so the sponsor can still maintain the infrastructure that they need. And so hopefully that helps to answer that question for the person who had it. And I think it's a really good question. It comes up quite a bit. We also got the question coming in beforehand. What are the steps to transfer sponsorship to a county or state when a town would like to abandon its sponsorship for a dam? This one comes up quite a bit, often. For example, some of the dams that were built in one of the states I worked in were built by irrigation companies to protect their canals or soil conservation districts. And now, instead of soil conservation districts and farming and ranching infrastructure downstream, we've got entire towns and cities downstream of these structures. You really have to navigate these very carefully. But NRCS is there to help and provide technical assistance and to help give advice on these types of issues. But the first thing we would do would be to modify the watershed agreement, and basically either adding on to the list of sponsors and just adding additional sponsors, or removing some sponsors. Maybe it's been 50 years since the last watershed agreement, the O&M agreement, and some of those entities don't even exist anymore. And so we're updating to the city or town or county or even state government if they want to take on the ownership of those dams. And then your most important person, especially in relation to dams, this question was related to a dam, was working with your state regulator. State dam safety is not going to allow, ownership of this infrastructure, these dams, because there's a risk to life and property of those downstream. If these things are to fail, they're going to want to make sure that there's an owner and someone responsible to perform the needed maintenance and and continue to operate them in a safe manner. And so also working with the regulator and updating their records of the change is really important. And often it's just a matter of looking at which entities now are benefiting. If it was a district or a small group of landowners that had got together and some of the sponsorship is changing. It's just a matter of updating those watershed agreements, the operation and maintenance agreements with NRCS, and then also working with your regulator if those practices are regulated in your state. So hopefully that helps to answer that question as well. Next one, these are, if you'll believe, these are watershed dams. This doesn't look like Oklahoma, like what's going on here. As you'll see here, some of these dams, these are in southern Utah, so kind of a more arid environment than you're used to seeing. As you can see here, this is the dam embankment. You probably can't even hardly tell that that's one of our NRCS watershed dams, but it sure is. And it used to protect some irrigation canals that ran downstream from filling with sediment after large storm events. You can see the rills and the different the erosion on the mountain that was coming down and filling their irrigation canals. And so, as you can see now, these watershed dams are now protecting blossoming communities. And so we run into this a lot where these dams were built under a low hazard situation. It was basically farmsteads or farmland that was flooded, or irrigation canals that filled with sediment when these dams weren't there. And now that the dams are there, they're providing protection to hundreds and even thousands of residents, and they really weren't built to do that. And so this is where our rehabilitation program really comes in and does great work to protect those who live beneath these dams that were built to maybe a low hazard situation, and they are more of a high hazard situation. So what happens if there's encroachment in the easement? As you can see right here, this was the auxiliary spillway right here on this dam. And you can see we've got homes like literally built right into there was a nice flat spot here, so they built a garage onto this home in the flat spot, which was our auxiliary spillway. And so when we rehabilitated this dam, we worked with the sponsor and then directed flows. There was actually a series of dams in this location, and we were able to direct flows to another one of our dams and change the place where the auxiliary spillway ran out. You'll also see here in this area, there's a large amount of green vegetation. Kind of stands out in this red rock area of the state where it's very arid, and we're in a 4 to 6 inch precip zone annually. These landowners had been irrigating their trees and their gardens that they'd planted right on the embankment of the dam. And so these are things that sponsors face. Even though those structures are there and the sponsor is working to keep them operated and maintained on the inside, sometimes towards the outer fringes of where those dams are, so on the downstream side of the embankment, the sponsors really got to be wary of that, and at least during the annual inspection, making sure that their easement is protected, and that folks aren't irrigating the dam embankment, for example, and planting a garden there, because it happens. And so that's really important to catch on those annual inspections by the sponsor. And in this case, we also had issues with the easements being recorded. They were signed, and we finally found copies, us together working with the sponsor and the city, who now wanted to take these over rather than the irrigation company that originally built them as sponsor. These were ones where the city took over ownership of them and was able to find the necessary documents and finally get them recorded. Some of that work had not been done back in the 50s and 60s when they were built. Just another example of the issues that can be run into and things you need to watch out for as a watershed project sponsor. Here's another project of ours. As you'll notice here along the fringe, the sponsor's easement was kind of clear up in this area. If you'll follow my mouse, and you can see a lot of times, landowners are pushing into those areas and planting gardens, and largely, not an impact until we decide to change the elevation of change the storage elevation in the reservoir. And so when we went into rehabilitation on this one, again, with development, things happen, and the highway department had come in and built a reservoir for their runoff inside the area where our dam, our water storage was. And so you run into all these sorts of issues as you get a lot of development around some of our dams. That encroachment is a real issue, and the sponsor has to be wary of and mindful of that encroachment and making sure that they're kind of tracking what's going on with their reservoir. I'll head to the next one. And so now, what do I do if there's encroachment into an EWP easement? Now, this is an example. This big debris removal type projects where you're removing, encroachment into an EWP easement in a place where you might be doing debris removal. It's probably not an issue. If the practice isn't very structural, it's not a real issue. Here's a stream crossing, stream crossing with a road access into a subdivision, and as you can see, there's major erosion on the downstream side of the road here, and so protecting the easement in that case is very important. You want to make sure that the sponsors maintaining as that stream bank or the grade stabilization work is done on the downstream side of this road, that the county road department has a good easement, and that they're monitoring that and making sure that they're the only ones doing work inside that area. In this case, from a large flood event, the stream moved a significant distance away from where it was, and as you can see, some homes were caught in the path of where the river had moved. And again, the after build was this stream bank protection along the face of that, protecting those homes. Now, a lot of this work, as you can see, if you're looking from the aerial view, you're really not going to access those sites and build that from accessing each of these individual homes. But as these practices were installed in EWP, the sponsor chose to use permanent easements along the riverway, where the top of this stream bank protection was installed, so that they could come in and maintain that and continue to take care of that. Then they were also working with the permitting agencies to make sure that any woody debris development down in the river bottom area, after it kind of came back in, that they were able to get in and operate, or to maintain that. And so it's important to think about these kind of things before you install the practices, or even when they're in design, that sponsors understand kind of what and how they're going to operate and maintain those practices. And from the NRCS side, it's really important that we as designers and we as planners plan for those activities, so that we make a way for the sponsor to be successful in what we do. So whether you're on the NRCS side of this or the sponsor side of this, it's really important to think about, how am I going to operate and maintain this infrastructure, and how will I access each of these individual sites, and how will I fix problems that come up, or other situations. Here's another example, and sometimes you're, after a wildfire especially, this is speaking more to EWP, but sometimes you're literally on the side of the mountain trying to provide some sort of protection for downstream areas. Here we've got a lot of homes in a developed area. There's not a lot of runoff until after a flood event, and so we're installing these very temporary type practices to capture any sediment, debris, and things that we can high up in the watershed to prevent it from coming down and filling stormwater systems that will function well as long as we keep the debris and sediment out of these after a wildfire. And so in the West, we face this a lot with our wildfires. And so again, thinking about how you're going to operate and maintain these types of practices, and these were designed to just be temporary, because in 3 to 5 years, the watershed heals and you don't have near the runoff that you normally would. But during those 3 to 5 years, we have to figure out how to maintain those. And then we figure, after the 3 to 5 years and the watershed's healed, these temporary practices, just fence posts and other items, you can either walk a mini X in there and remove those sediment fences, or continue to maintain them. Some of the municipalities continue to maintain these small little structures above their town just in case, so they're set for the next fire. So hopefully that helps you to think about some of those sponsor responsibilities of operating, maintaining the infrastructure that you would install under several of the watershed programs. And we've tried to capture a lot of those in a different light than maybe you've thought about before. Now, April talked a little bit about one of the sponsors' responsibilities is land treatment above the reservoir, or upstream of the reservoir, right? Because if she said if we're above the reservoir, really we're up in the clouds, and I guess there's a large watershed above us as well. But we're talking more about the watershed on the ground, so we'll use the word upstream, and we'll change our manual to reflect that. But thinking about the lands upstream of our reservoir, having a conservation plan. As you look at this watershed, if this were the example watershed above our reservoir, you'd have all these private lands, in the downstream part of the area, and largely those conservation plans could be actual farm bill or other NRCS program conservation plans. There could be state conservation programs that have plans, or easements that are held, conservation easements that are held, or lands that are regulated by a county or a state, wildlife type easements. Then as you get up into these higher areas, maybe the lands are controlled by the Bureau of Land Management or U.S. Forest Service and those federal lands. So as part of that 50%, if you have federal lands in your watershed, or lands that are held by a conservation agency, for example, that have an active conservation plan or a forest plan for the Forest Service lands, those lands count towards the 50% if they're managed by other conservation type agencies with an active land management plan. And so hopefully that helps to explain that, whether it's the Farm Bill and NRCS related conservation plans, or the other federal or easement held lands that have a conservation plan under them. All those ways to get to having more than 50% of the lands covered by a conservation plan, and the requirement is at least 50% for reservoirs, for new reservoirs, or for rehabilitation. If there are sedimentation issues in the watershed, then the sponsor has to make sure that they've updated those and make another effort in getting 50% of the lands covered by a conservation plan, so we can reduce the sedimentation. Here's another question that came into us. It was, how can irrigation districts help handle eminent domain and secure rights of ways when they're operational organizations, not property holders? This is a great question. Comes up a lot in our irrigation states. And I just wanted to show an example of a project that I worked on. This was an old historic irrigation canal that kind of ran along the side of this very steep mountain, as we needed to bring water out at a higher elevation to irrigate some of the lands within the county. And so it made its way through the canyon and then out into the valley at a kind of a higher elevation, so those lands could be irrigated. And it's very nice because it works well for gravity irrigation and reduces the amount of pumping that's needed to run our irrigation systems. So we of course enclosed the irrigation canal, and the irrigation company was having a hard time obtaining the necessary the land rights for this project. And so they found a way to propose that their new irrigation canal alignment could, once it was backfilled and finished, that it could become a trail that was available for residents of the county to come walk on and use, and became a wonderful amenity. And the county helped them in acquiring the land rights for this area. And it was kind of a win-win, and we brought another sponsor in. And so that's why I've said here, sometimes it's partnering with other interested organizations to help you get what you need. So over the top of this canal, when it was done, of course, we placed the backfill, and it became a nice walking trail and a wonderful way to access it for operation and maintenance. So sometimes bringing in that other partner, that other entity that also has something that they need, you can help with eminent domain needs or securing other rights of ways. So hopefully that helps answer that question for whoever had that. Another project that I wanted to talk about as well is, thinking about irrigation projects. Sometimes the picture on the left is what you see a lot of, coming through some areas where you're coming through lots of areas of homes. I love what somebody had spray painted on one of the bridges here. This is an area where the canal was used by the local community as a tubing thing. They would, when the canal was in the summer, people would come and throw their tube in the water and float through the town on their tubes. And so their statement was, "This is water, not property." So getting land rights through these kind of irrigation situations, especially where many of these irrigation canals didn't have written easements, but it's more, just as April described out the types of easements, this is more a prescriptive easement. These canals were installed in this example here, in the 1870s, 1880s, they were installed and have been used ever since. And so predates most of the development around those. And so, again, thinking about the infrastructure that you're installing and how you're going to operate and maintain that, and make sure that you're able to secure the rights of ways that you need, finding ways to make it attractive to other entities and to other uses sometimes is the way to do. And so, to a large amount, as we pipe these irrigation canals, often, we're putting trails through these areas because it helps with acquiring the land rights, and it helps get the irrigation districts assistance through the county or city, and the support from those local government entities to help them to maintain their projects and reduce the seepage and infiltration goals that, like, the irrigation companies have. As you can see, you pick up a lot of debris, a lot of sediment, there's a lot of infiltration, and so it's a lot of water lost with these open canals. And so converting those to more efficient systems also is important, but also realizing that we have there may have been historic uses, like in this section, the irrigation company considered leaving a section of canal open for residents to float through in and maintain that kind of historic use, understanding that, there's going to be some seepage that we're still going to lose in this area, or some debris that enters our system, but we also want to continue to provide that amenity. So from the sponsor side, things are very complicated sometimes with historic uses, whether they were, their irrigation company did not set it up as a recreational facility, but many residents in the community use those as a recreational facility. And so you have to think about that and think about the impact that the practices that you install have, and how you're going to operate and maintain those into the future. Again, thinking about how practices were installed, this is an irrigation diversion on a large river. It was installed. Here's some pictures of them pouring this layer of concrete over the log cribbing that was installed underneath this, to then divert water up and out of the river for irrigation and also for power generation at this location. And this is a large river system. We're just a few hundred miles upstream of the Grand Canyon on the Green River. And very complicated area. But thinking about, anticipating your future needs as you're one of these folks here installing the practices originally, and you think today of you installing the practices that you'll install through the Watershed Operations Program, thinking about how the future will change. And, when we replaced the structure back in 2014, all of a sudden, we had a lot more things going on with the structure. We added some more gates on this side. This is an intake for power generation and irrigation. Goes off that way, and irrigation comes off this side of the river as well. And there was a need for T&E species fish to travel up and down. So we had to create a fish ladder in it. We also had to provide boat navigation down through the diversion as well, and also be able to pass, huge flows with very low head. So that's why you have such a long weir length. But then also the boat navigation through here, and making sure that boat navigation was, able to allow users to pass through several hundred miles of river with their boats. And so, thinking about what you're building today and trying to anticipate what future needs is just really important on the operation and maintenance and replacement side. Thinking about how you're going to perform that in the future and trying to anticipate future needs is really, really important. All right. Here's a question we got come in. How would a conservation district go about collecting taxes for a watershed dam operation and maintenance in Oklahoma? This is a question that had come from Oklahoma, the wonderful state that we're in and visiting this week and enjoying here. And there's two ways that I've seen it with the districts that I've worked with. And so I just thought I'd describe those. And I'm sure that there's many other ways to do this. But generally, one of the ways that's done is through a mill levy. And so the mill levy is basically a property tax. And it's applied to property. It's annually based on its assessed value. And so residents that live within the confines of this boundary that's created, they agree that they want to pay this tax to form the district and receive the benefits from the structural measures that are installed in the area. And so, so a lot of those districts were created when some of the watershed work was done back in the past. And that's really how a lot of the districts receive funding is through mill levies in property taxes. Another second way I've seen districts formed and not be related to property taxes is we had a flood control district or authority that was formed, and those can be also done. Again, votes if it's done through property taxes, then you basically have to get that on the ballot and form that flood control or conservancy district. And then, people in that area have to vote to become a part of that and agree to be taxed. But this flood control authority took it a different direction. And instead, they got each of the cities to approve. They had kind of a regional water supplier that supplied drinking water to several of the cities that were in the area. And so each city chose to become a part of this flood control authority and paid for it by a certain a cost per water connection. So every household, every business that had a water connection and paid a water bill to the city, which was then collected. There was like $1 or $5 a month, and it was just added on that way. And so there's some ideas that I've seen. I don't know what things look like in the area that you were at, but there's maybe a couple more ideas to help you to think about how to go about collecting taxes. I'm sure it's different in every state and every municipality on how to do that and legalities of all that. But those are some things that I've seen done in my career. So just trying to provide some helpful information. Let's see. Now let's go to NRCS responsibilities. These are important as well. NRCS is responsible to overall management of the watershed program, to make sure that the program is organized and the practices are kept track of, and that opportunities are made available to the residents of their states. And so the state conservationist is a responsible federal official for NRCS. Again, as Ray said earlier, if you haven't met or talked to your state conservationist, it's a good person to meet in your state, because they appoint a watershed program manager for each of these watershed programs. And sometimes that's one person that's for all 3 programs. Sometimes it's 3 people for the 3 individual programs. That just depends on each state and how much work they have going on. And then NRCS is responsible to help write and create these watershed project plans and perform reviews on those plans. And sometimes that work is performed by the sponsor, that their sponsor will take and hire an architectural and engineering firm or an environmental firm to perform the watershed project plan work and to write that plan. Sometimes NRCS hires that directly, like through a federal contract with a federal contractor, and hires a contractor to do that work. But sometimes it's done through a cooperative agreement, and the local sponsor actually hires the firm to write that plan. The 4th one, implementation assistance. NRCS can assist in providing the design and construction assistance and help with that, or again, through the project sponsor. The sponsor can perform some of those activities and be reimbursed by NRCS for the work that NRCS would have done. NRCS also, or the contractor performing the work, is responsible to provide a real property rights work map. And again, this just helps the sponsor in determining what easements are necessary, what land needs to be acquired for the practices that'll be installed as part of the project. And that's the designer and the planner really taking a look at how it's going to be operated and maintained, how it's going to be installed, what things are need to be happened. Do we need to move utilities as part of that? What things need to happen for us to be able to install the practices that we're looking for. Another NRCS responsibility is operation, maintenance, and replacement technical assistance. So at any time, over the life of the project, the sponsor can request technical assistance help from NRCS, and whether that's us out helping perform dam inspections or helping to provide designs or just to give good technical advice to the sponsor over the life of the project, that's what we're here for. NRCS also certifies that there's the land treatment upstream of the reservoirs, and again maintains an official administrative record for the watershed project. So those are kind of a brief overview of some of the things that NRCS does, and I think it's important to highlight some of those. So the first one of those ones we mentioned was that we need to create a real property rights work map, and it shows the minimum area and the areas where land rights are needed for each work of improvement, and that's provided to the sponsor so that they understand what easements are going to be required. Sometimes a rehabilitation, we've got to raise the dam elevation to meet the new criteria, and that requires going upstream of the dam and acquiring additional water rights. Sometimes it's downstream or to one of the sides of the dam where we've got to do more work. Acquiring land rights sometimes is a big deal, and those land rights can be used as part of to offset the cost share and provided in kind to the sponsor or to NRCS as a contribution towards the project. And April talked a lot about that. The sponsor signs an MOU with NRCS and then goes about acquiring those real property rights and those easements needed to construct the project. And the cost of those is counted towards their sponsor's 35% cost share for rehabilitation. So those are important things to talk to.
Bronson, break in here.
Yes,
all the rehab projects require that 50% land upstream be in a conservation plan? Is that a requirement, national requirement?
For new dams, it is. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
And that's in the law. It isn't just us being mean. Again, Congress wrote it that way. They wanted to protect their investment downstream. And so for rehabilitation, if sedimentations are concerned, then we do require that. So thanks for jumping in there, Ray.
Yeah,
Kind of scared me.
and you were
I've been
speaking
talking to
about,
myself for so long.
yeah, you were speaking about the MOUs too for in-kind contributions or these agreements. And one of the participants said, at what point can the MOUs or the agreements occur? Does it have to wait until you've actually got the plan authorized, or can you start earlier?
Yeah, because until the plan's authorized, there really isn't a proposed action that
Okay.
NRCS is. Until the chief of NRCS authorizes that plan, we really haven't said that we're going to do anything. So we'd hate the sponsor to get too far out in front and then go acquire all these land rights and then say something falls apart, right? And we determine that, oh dear, the project is not feasible and the sponsor has spent significant resources
Yeah.
acquiring these property rights. We'd hate to put somebody in a situation like that. So that's the reason.
That doesn't predispose, though, the fact that you should have meetings, regular meetings, talk about it,
Right.
scratch on
Yeah.
paper, put together what
Yes.
would look like to be an agreement so that when the chief authorizes it, you're ready, right?
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
you don't put any signatures or dates on something until after the chief is authorized. So a lot of work goes into these agreements and discussions and what it looks like when it's working like it should, and et cetera. So pretty important. Okay.
Definitely.
Oh, back to you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right. All right. Here's some other considerations. NRCS can federally contract for these for the construction, for the design, for the planning. NRCS often has to bring in contractors. We just are way we just don't have enough people, and so probably 80 to 90% of the work done in the watershed programs is done through contractors, the technical work, with some assistance from NRCS, and then in some places, some instances, NRCS fully implements the practice through either self-performing or through federal construction and federal engineering contracts that we have. So NRCS has an IDIQ contract that we have. It's basically firms on retainer throughout the country to provide technical work for us, to write these plans, to perform design work, to perform construction inspection and quality assurance and these other items during the construction of the project. And so sometimes those are done through the federal contracting. Sometimes they're also done through cooperative agreement. And just to point out, when we acquire things federally, it's through the federal acquisition regulations. It's pretty rigid, and it's kind of how we do our work, and it's the Bible of federal acquisitions. And now through sponsor locally led contract method of installation, again, that's using our clauses found in 2 CFR 200 and 2 CFR 400 that then take the place of that, and largely it becomes the sponsor's acquisition regulations so the sponsor is acquiring either the design or the watershed plan or the construction of the project, and there's not as many our federal acquisition regulations really don't apply. It's mostly the acquisition regulations of the sponsor with some caveats, that there be a drug-free workplace and, that the folks are paid a fair wage and things. But through the sponsor led, it's a lot more flexible in that the sponsor, it's their acquisition regulations. Now there are difficulties and issues with that as well, and there's positives and negatives. And so as you work with your local NRCS office in your state on your project, then you'll work through those things and decide whether use the sponsor gonna lead the method of installation or whether the NRCS you're gonna have them do that through federal construction or federal contracting. So that's an early discussion to have with your NRCS office. Here's kind of some comparing things side by side. In federal contracting, Davis-Bacon wage rates apply. Generally, Davis-Bacon doesn't apply if we're doing a sponsor-hired contract. Anyways, there's kind of these differences, following state licensing requirements with no state licensing requirements on the federal construction side. The federal contractor has to pay taxes, and then For sponsor-led, some of the municipalities relieve them of the sales tax so that they can get a lower price on their construction. And so, this is just kind of a side-by-side showing some of the benefits and challenges that are created by choosing the way your project is installed. Now, the sponsor locally led contract, since we have a few NRCS people on, I'll just take 2 minutes and talk about, things that NRCS employees can't do when it's a sponsor-led contract. And that's we can't direct the work of the contractor like we do when it's a federal contract. They are not our contractor, they're the sponsor's contractor. And so any disputes with the sponsor contractor need to be handled through the sponsor. And if there's trouble with the installation, rather than the NRCS federal contracting officer handling those disputes, the sponsor is handling those disputes because it's the sponsor's contractor. And so there are some challenges to things like that. Sponsors taking a lot more responsibility on when they hire the work done themselves rather than have NRCS procure it through the federal process. But there's also some flexibility in there, and the sponsor has more control as well. So you kind of have to decide again at the start of the project whether you'll acquire those things from the sponsor side or whether you'll have NRCS acquire them through the federally contracted side. So hopefully that helps you to think about some of the things. And of course, as NRCS employees, we really can't help with the sponsor with obtaining land rights or permits. That's really a thing for the sponsor to do. Lastly, conflicts of interest that come up when things are sponsor-led. The sponsor needs to make sure that there isn't conflict of interest and that there's not, the sponsor's nephew or niece getting the awards for all the work that's being done in a watershed. And so we do keep a close eye on that conflict of interest thing, just to make sure that there isn't a conflict of interest and that it's free and open competition and anyone can come procure or be a part of the great watershed work out there.